Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Too many federal IT projects collapse under their own weight. They wind up with bloated contracts, shifting requirements, and tools no one wants to use. The fix is better ownership through product managers. And here to explain how they can make all the difference is former director of the Technology Transformation Service at GSA, Ann Lewis. Ann, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here, Terry.
You've written about this shift from a compliance mindset to a delivery mindset in federal agencies. Tell us how that works in practice. What might need to change to make that a reality?
Well, Terry, I think it all comes down to something called product management. In the private sector tech world, product managers are the people who decide what are we building, for whom, when, and why. It's kind of like a strategic leadership role that is deeply technical, that acts as an interface layer between business concerns and users. In government, they can act as a interface layer between all of the different stakeholders that federal agencies have in their programs and the vendor implementation teams that do the majority of the implementation work. But product managers today are largely missing from government, and this is something that leads to hidden costs, hidden risk, and prevents the government from being able to fully control service delivery as much as it should be able to.
When I think about a product manager, I think about the person who's delivering a particular car model or a new product on the grocery shelves. I don't really think of it in terms of government programs. What am I missing in the connection there?
Well, I think you can build on those concepts, but think about products in the government context as digital services that make up the benefit systems that Americans use every single day. So if you're a veteran, for example, a veteran benefit system is a product. If you are a person who's gone onto USA.gov to figure out what kinds of disaster assistance might be available to you, your experience in trying to get that information is itself a product. So all of the websites that make up all of the federal agency systems and services themselves contain products and are products, and we need product managers to be able to decide, is this working for Americans? And if not, what can we do in a low-cost, low-risk way to improve that quality of service so that everyone can get what they need from their government?
That's a really different way of thinking about government programs because we often think about them as a compliance exercise. Are we following all the rules and making sure that this gets out? But a product manager seems to me really puts themselves in the seat of the client or the customer and thinks about how that experience works.
That's exactly right. And I think it's still important to follow all of the rules. All the rules in government exist for a reason, but there's additional strategic work to do in addition to checking off all of the boxes and making sure that everything's compliant. And that strategic work comes down to deciding, does this system actually work? Does it work for the users who are trying to use it? Because sometimes that question gets lost or forgotten, and you can spend hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of people's time building systems that when they come together don't add up to something that actually works for Americans. And this is something I think we've all experienced when trying to use government digital services.
Give us a couple of examples of where it didn't work.
Well, I think healthcare.gov is probably the most famous and most quoted example, but this happens all the time in every administration. Usually when you have hundreds of millions of dollars or perhaps even billions of dollars, many people within one agency working on a big project over a long timeline with many different vendor teams, because getting work done across thousands of people is hard in both the private and the public sector. So you need people who are not just able to coordinate that work and make decisions that span contracts and systems, but you need to give them the authority and empower them to make the right decisions so that they can ask the question, have we talked to our users yet? Do we understand whether or not this phone system, this help desk, this eligibility process, this adjudication process, have we taken a look at this process end to end and actually talked to the people who are using it and actually understand what's working and what's not so that we can make the most pragmatic, cost-effective use of our resources to solve the right problems at the right times in the right order?
So healthcare.gov was, as you say, this hugely complex undertaking, billions of dollars, many contracts, lots of contractors. It had program managers, maybe didn't have product managers. So help us understand the difference between a program manager and a product manager.
A program manager usually has operational authority across all of the components and resources that make up a project. You also have project managers in there who coordinate execution. These are the people who keep the to-do lists and make sure that Work is happening on time, on budget, and within scope. But product managers have to do with that scope and those strategic decisions that get made every single day in every task that implementation workers deal with. Product managers define the problem that we're trying to solve. And if you've ever been in a situation where you get a whole group of people together and ask everyone what they want and try to write that down into a big list and have that add up to a decision or a strategic focus, we know that usually doesn't work. You often need someone to define the problem, hear from everyone, but then make decisions at a high level and a low level. So product managers are people who do that, and they exist from the bottom to the top of the org chart. Product managers can be involved in Scrum teams working with vendors. They can do things like sign off on user stories, which is a basic description of work that can be done from a digital perspective by an implementation team. But they can also have high-level strategic decision-making authority. For example, coordinating across many vendor teams to work on a large project that involves integrating the work of thousands of people together. It still needs to be a small number of people's job to decide, does this work? How do we prioritize? Because we'll always have limited time and money, and we need to make the best use of our resources. And when we're prioritizing, what are we focusing on? What are we paying attention to? Because at the end of the day, if you're building digital services for people, you need to know who those people are, and you need to talk to them and get their feedback, not just one time at the end of the project, but ideally as iteratively and regularly as possible, sometimes every week or every 2 weeks. And it's product managers, product owners, and product strategists who do that work in the private sector and can do that work in the public sector too.
I'm speaking with Ann Lewis. She's the former Director of Technology Transformation Services at GSA, currently working with the Niskanen Center. Well, you talk about commercial practices. Is there a model that product managers could follow if we got them into government to oversee these big government programs and projects?
Absolutely. And in fact, vendor partners are often expecting the government product managers to exist and to plug into their teams in industry standard ways. They'll often ask at the start of a project, so who's the product owner? Do you have product managers? Can you embed them in our project? And if agencies employ product managers, which often they don't, then they can work together using industry standard best practices for collaboration. But vendors will often be in a situation where the agency doesn't even employ any product managers, and then they'll be kind of stuck. They'll ask, who can sign off on this decision? Who can decide whether this is done? Who can help us prioritize? And often the answer is, from the agency perspective, is we're not sure. Sometimes that work falls to contract officers or project managers who aren't necessarily set up or empowered to be able to make these kinds of strategic calls. So vendors do the best they can, but they're limited with the boundaries of the contracts that control the scope of their work. So just even getting product managers into government goes a long way towards driving towards a more effective model. But you can also take a broad scope organizational design perspective on this and think about how can we set up an organization that by default tries to deliver the best quality services that actually work for Americans with the lowest cost and the lowest complexity. And if you take that organizational design perspective, you can start to talk about operating models. So an operating model is a blueprint for how an organization delivers value. It translates the strategy, which is what do we want to achieve here, into execution, which is how we actually do it. So if you take a look at operating models across the private sector, there are a couple of patterns that show up, and it seems like a most effective approach today in 2025 is something called the product operating model, which is built around durable cross-functional product teams that include product managers, but also are focused on being able to be autonomous, to be able to work towards outcomes instead of outputs. They work iteratively. They focus on getting as much real-world feedback as possible. I think government should consider adopting a product operating model in federal agencies because I think this is something that will allow us to be able to most effectively deliver the services and the benefit systems that Americans need.
Are there structural changes, policy changes, HR changes that would be necessary to adopt that product manager model?
Yes, there would be a lot of changes that would be required. So it's kind of a controversial suggestion, although if anybody's interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend that you read the article on this topic that Jen Palka and I just published at Niskanen Center on product operating models. It would require a redesign of a couple of key levers of how government works. So I'm not saying this will be easy, but I am suggesting that we start to talk about it. It would require that budgeting, from the appropriations process down to how agencies manage their own budgets, becomes more incremental and outcome focused. And to be able to fund these cross-functional product teams that are focused on understanding a category of users' experience with a particular component of a benefit system and continuously improving that over time. The default model in government is these big one-time builds with start and end dates, fixed amounts of funding that may or may not have anything to do with how much the implementation work actually costs, that start with a requirements gathering phase that makes a lot of assumptions up front and then incentivizes all of the implementation teams to build against those requirements. These requirements may or may not have anything to do with how the world works, how the technology ecosystem is evolving, especially in the era of generative AI, and may or may not have anything to do with what users actually need. And what we want to do is shift away from those monolithic, one-time big builds, because building software and digital services and systems is not like buying an airplane. It's not like building a ship. It's completely different. Software is kind of like a living thing. It's continuously evolving. And so you need to fund it and structure the teams that build it in a way that supports that. So that's one big area. I think we also need to take a look at procurement processes and ensure that when it's appropriate, that agency procurement processes are able to support modular, adaptable delivery and do things like user research and user testing as regularly as possible. Because the more you talk to the people using the things you're building, the more likely you are to build the right things for the lowest cost. And then we also need to take a look at oversight processes. Oversight processes, like appropriations and procurement processes, are very focused on, you wrote down these set of things that you said you were going to do. Did you do them? And that is a valuable process. But if the things you wrote down have nothing to do with veterans' benefits delivery, the integrity of our social security systems, our ability to support our war fighters, our ability to support senior citizens as they transition into other stages of life, what's really important here is government making good on its promise to the public? And sometimes the requirements document that we write at one point in the future doesn't fully capture that, and we need to be able to have processes that adapt and meet people where they are.
Are you sensing a growing energy for this kind of change? And if so, where is it starting to come up from?
Well, there are a lot of programs across agencies that are already using this model in a way that has been more behind the scenes and not as recognized. But I'd love to call out the VA as doing this work in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways that has had a significant positive impact on the experience of veterans over the last 10 years. I've never worked at the VA, so I'm mostly just giving credit where I feel like it's due here. But there are a lot of ways in which they have employed innovative strategies for outcomes-focused delivery, bringing on product managers, creating and supporting cross-functional product teams, thinking about how to do budgeting in a more continuous way. And I think they also do a lot of great work on creating feedback loops with veteran communities that connect how people are experiencing their systems all the way up to the leadership level. And that's such valuable feedback if you're a senior leader in an agency or in any large organization. These senior leaders, we usually have no idea what's going on, really. We just know what the people reporting to us tell us. Any places where you can find low-lift ways of connecting up the experience of people to the leaders who are making decisions about the organizational structures that contain the systems that need to deliver benefits to the users, you are helping the organization function more effectively. So, the VA does things like leadership ride-alongs to clinics, listening on help desks, call lines, just taking a look at what people are complaining about or looking at the data, the behavioral data of veterans using these systems to try and understand where are people getting stuck. All of these things are useful. I think any organization that values feedback and treats it as a continuous learning mechanism that is used to adjust decisions and figure out how to structure resources across an organization is a very healthy pattern.
I've been speaking with Ann Lewis, former Director of Technology Transformation Services at GSA, currently working with the Niskanen Center. Ann, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization, really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences, and that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern. kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction. But of course, it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. You know, that's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are three things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You know, you are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, you know, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. You know, absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally, or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, you know, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, you know, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, you know, immigrant kids in poverty. You know, he was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, you know, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.